Nice to see you.
Thank you. Where's Mackenzie? So can we start? All right. God, it's great to see a lot of old friends here. So welcome. My name is George Perkovich. I'm a vice president for studies here at Carnegie. And it's my pleasure to welcome those of you who are with us in the room and those of you online for this book talk and event with Mariana Budjeryn. And the book is Inheriting the Bomb, the Collapse of the USSR and the Nuclear Disarmament of Ukraine. Mariana is a senior research fellow at the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and specifically managing the Atom Project, which is a lot to put on a business card.
Indeed.
And I want to begin by saying that I have not met Mariana until today. And so I read the book, with curiosity and not much familiarity. And I'm going to embarrass her now because what jumps off the pages of the book is that she's absolutely brilliant, first of all, and an exceptionally good writer. The sentences are both strong and beautiful at the same time. It's quite a remarkable piece of art in a sense, as well as scholarship, and it's clever and nuanced throughout. Tugjan is our dear friend, Tugjan Kasenova, had told me about the book, and I'd love it and everything else. And after the first couple of pages, I sent her an email saying I was kind of blown away by it. Mariana and the book are admirably judicious. This is a very difficult thing to write about your country. You're writing about an event that was 30 years ago, but in the context of what's happened since 2014 and even worse since 2022. And yet the judiciousness and fairness come through in ways that are, again, I think really impressive. And then you're obviously an energetic researcher, maybe a little obsessive, I couldn't tell, but I mean, it's like she was in every archive in I don't know how many different countries, and then interviewing all the different players. So it's like really thoroughly researched. Some of us would have said, I got the basic story at this point and kind of move on, but I get the impression you kept digging. So the result is a really masterful telling of a very important story, important for all sorts of reasons, obviously kind of regional history, world history in terms of the dissolution of the Soviet Union and that aftermath. Anything having to do with nuclear weapons, proliferation, non-proliferation, it's important for all of those reasons. So I warned her I was going to embarrass her, but I can't encourage you strongly enough to read the book. It really is terrific. How I want to begin our conversation, Mariana, is, and again, there are a number of people in the room who were actually involved mostly in U.S. diplomacy at the time and working in and with Ukraine and others on this. But for those who may not have been so familiar then, set up the basic situation, let's say late fall of 91, dissolution of the Soviet Union. How were nuclear issues being perceived in Ukraine, and kind of what was being set up for the drama that was to come? And then we'll get into that story.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you so much for your very kind introduction and assessment of the book. It was really a labor of love. And a very, very long labor of love. It took me a while to research and write the book. And before I go on, answering your question and setting up this end of 1991, what strikes me, what kind of my journey of writing this book is that, we say that the future is unpredictable, right? We don't know, we can't predict the future. Oftentimes the past is more unpredictable than the future. I started my research before 2014 as my PhD dissertation. And at that point, Ukraine's disarmament, as well as the disarmament of Belarus and Kazakhstan, that was a marginal story in the grand, big nuclear picture. And I had to actually fight tooth and nail in my department for them to allow me to keep this topic. People said, what's the relevance anymore? I mean, it's gone. Those weren't even Ukrainian weapons to give up. And, when will we see another nuclear superpower fall apart, right? So where are these relevancies? And I persevered. And then after 2014, people stopped asking why this is important. And I finished and submitted the manuscript in April 2021. So before the full-scale invasion. And when the proofs came back, it was already in the spring of 2022. And I thought, did what I write does that still stand? Do I reevaluate my conclusions? How do I rewrite the introduction and the conclusion? How do I incorporate this important development into the manuscript at this late stage? And after reflection, yes, my conclusions still stand. I decided to just add a paragraph to each, the introduction and to the conclusion, to sort of reflect on the further significance, on the further development of Ukraine's nuclear story after the full-scale invasion. But reverse 3 decades before that to 1991, Ukraine is, August 1991, Ukraine declares independence right after the coup. In this country, we look at December 1991 as sort of the official end of the Soviet Union, when Gorbachev resigns and his Cheged, his nuclear codes, get transferred to Yeltsin. But from the local standpoint, from the Kyiv's vantage point, that was already, those events went unnoticed. In Ukraine, August 24th, 1991 was the official end of the Soviet Union. From that point on, Ukraine regards itself as an independent sovereign nation and goes forward to build its statehood, nationhood, establish diplomatic relations worldwide, and so forth. Nor did the nuclear issue enter Ukrainian discourse just at that point when the nuclear superpower is disintegrating. The first appearance of the nuclear issue in Ukraine's political sphere was actually a year before that, with the adoption of a declaration of state sovereignty in July 1990. Which included a whole clause that said Ukraine in the future pledges to become a non-nuclear state and abide by these principles. And at that point, it was an entirely unilateral thing. There was no pressure from the US, there was no pressure from Russia, there was no vision of, kind of deals and negotiations and so forth. And the reason for that was twofold. One was Chernobyl, and the other one was an understanding of Ukrainian leaders at that point that the super centralized military establishment that went right over the heads of the Republican leaders, in the republics, would be a hindrance to the process of Ukraine attaining this independence, that those chains had to be severed first before Ukraine could really establish itself as an independent state, that those would be sort of ways in which Moscow will keep Ukraine tethered to. Now, history judged otherwise, and before these kind of chains of command, before these military connections could be severed, the Soviet Union collapses. And in the in the fall of 1991, Ukraine deliberates or begins to grapple in earnest with the reality of actually having this enormous nuclear inheritance on its territory. And the first thing Ukrainian leaders had to do is to actually find out what was there. They did not know. Ukraine's foreign minister, Zelenko, who meets with Western leaders, the first thing they ask is, what are you going to do with nuclear weapons? And how is the command control is going to work out? And, you know, what do you have? What are these ICBMs? How many? Who's in control? He admits to having to take notes and say, we'll get back to you with the answers. He couldn't answer these questions in that moment. So for Ukrainian leadership at that point, it's really a matter of actually coming to full terms with the situation that they have inherited. Now, in the United States at that point, starting with the coup of August 1991 in Moscow, the issue of proliferation of a possible kind of fracturing of Soviet nuclear arsenal along the lines of, you know, the successor republics, but also the safety and security of nuclear weapons and nuclear materials on the giant Eurasian landmass of the Soviet Union becomes front and center, one of the issues of the first order, both sort of within the expert community, and here I have to plug in, you know, the Balfour Center. At that time, it was, I don't think it was still called the Balfour Center, but certainly Graham Allison and Ash Carter and Steve Miller were all part of, you know, they were part of Track 2 dialogues with the Russians, and the Russians are telling them this is going to be a really bad thing if nuclear weapons end up in the hands of the Republican leaders, and, you know, big wave of proliferation. They kind of write their Soviet nuclear fission report, they write their memos, they go to Washington and pitch that. But Washington seems at that time, the Bush administration was already quite in tuned to that challenge. They're already in my state now, where I live, is the venerable state of Maine, at the Walker's Point and Kennebunkport, where President Bush was vacationing. I was there in August with his national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft. They're already deliberating and thinking at the end of August what would be the best policy response. It was, I mean, I have to say, just sifting through these documents, you know, nobody knew what was the right thing to do. It was a time of great upheaval, and it was also a time for great policy entrepreneurship, as it were. Now, one wonders if that might be still possible today. So then you had from the United States, in the course of the fall, two really important policy initiatives take shape. One is the presidential nuclear initiatives that come out of the White House, and then the CTR program, the Cooperative Threat Reduction Act, that comes through the sort of this policy community and through Senators Nunn and Lugar and through the Congress. And that sort of sets up, so these main kind of parameters of how the nuclear issue will be dealt with in the former Soviet Union get set up really during the fall. And also, the United States communicates in no uncertain terms to all of the former Soviet republics that there will be only one nuclear successor that will emerge out of the Soviet collapse. And, you know, in no uncertain terms, it is also communicated that the diplomatic recognition of Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan will hinge upon, you know, their pledges and their decisions on nuclear weapons that will be conducive to non-proliferation.
So that was brilliant. That's a great setup. And I mean, I think some of the things, again, looking back in hindsight, that people don't appreciate or recognize was how early on, and you talk about in 90, the central opinion in Ukraine was disarmament. I mean, we don't want these things, and it was part of, well, for all the reasons that you said. And then the story shifts right? And so you've kind of taken us up to where, you've got the U.S. and the world kind of coming, and you've got, insisting on certain things, and you set up where Ukraine had been, but then Ukraine's position starts to evolve, right? Take us through. I'm going to read, actually, a summary that you have in the book, just because I want people also to get a flavor of the written word, but then I want you to take us through it. In less than a year, so from let's say August 90 to the spring of 92, the question of nuclear weapons had undergone a profound transformation in Ukraine's political discourse, from outright renunciation to conditional disarmament, based on recognition of Ukraine's ownership of the weapons it pledged to surrender. The notion that Ukraine was the rightful owner of nuclear weapons on its territory originated among the national democratic forces and rapidly gained wider acceptance across the political spectrum. It emerged as a way not only, not even primarily, to exert financial and political concessions from the West, but as part of Ukraine's attempt to negotiate a post-Soviet settlement in which it can enjoy full sovereign equality with Russia as a Soviet successor state. That's even more poignant now in the last couple of years. But unpack it. What brought about that kind of change in consciousness and perception within Ukraine about the value of nuclear weapons and what they would mean?
So, like most things, these kind of shifts and notions emerged in relationships, right? It's not in a vacuum or in somebody's head. It's through the interactions that Ukrainian leaders had in that time. And one set of interactions was with the newly, ascendant, newly also independent Russian Federation. We forget that the Russian Federation was not synonymous with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union broke up, and out of it emerged the Russian Federation, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, right? All these constitutive republics. And so Ukrainian leaders were trying to feel out and to judge what this new Russia is going to be like. Is it going to be truly was the equal amongst equals, as President Yeltsin had put it, or will it be a bit more of the old, imperial Russia, the old Soviet Russia, the old Russia with all these kind of bad habits that Ukrainian leaders had suspected, especially those from the National Democratic camp that had sort of traditional historical suspicions towards how Moscow would behave. And rather early on, already into the early 1992, Ukrainian leaders begin to understand that there's, this new Russia is not just going to be just another aspiring democracy, that it might still be, a force that will want to assert itself in the region, and a force that will be reluctant to recognize Ukraine as just another equal sovereign state, right? And those interactions emerged through the kind of the early meetings of the Commonwealth of Independent States, right? The dealings there, but also, votes on establishing the Russian sovereignty over the city of Sevastopol in Crimea, the Black Sea base, the trips of someone like the vice president, Russian vice president at the time, name escapes me. Rutskoy, to the Black Sea Fleet, where they, hoist a Russian flag over the Black Sea Fleet, and all these sort of signs that become to start to emerge to kind of alert the Ukrainian leadership that, this might be still a very hostile region in which we will be operating. So that, again, this introduces a nuance and a reluctance and kind of the demands already voiced for the first time in April 1992 from the Ukrainian parliament to get security guarantees in exchange to get a deal, right? So it goes from sort of unconditional, we don't want these things, they're terrible weapons, here, take them, to, all right, let's sit and think about it. We still want to surrender them. but we want to surrender them in the right way. So much of the contestation, I think, that gets underappreciated, even at that time outside, is not about the whether to disarm, but it's about the how of the disarmament. And as part of that discourse, I think what Ukrainians, so that's kind of a set of interactions with the Russians. Now, the set of interaction with the Western interlocutors alarmed them also to the fact that in much of the Western, and here I really say the United States, because the United States was the primary actor in that space, and the allies took the US lead at the time on the nuclear issue. At least in the impressions of the Ukrainians at the time, they sensed that these decades of interactions between Washington and Moscow kind of created blind spots for many people in Washington that, the Soviet Union was not reducible to Russia, that there were these other constitutive parts, that it wasn't just that suddenly the earth opened up and out came the Kazakhs and these Belarusians and Armenians, and who are these people and how do we deal with them? That not only did, say, Kazakhstan and Ukraine inherited nuclear weapons, they inherited huge chunks of the military-industrial complex and huge chunks of the capacity that delivered these weapons. They inherited scientists with clearances in the nuclear Soviet nuclear project. Kazakhstan supplied, uranium for the forged fuel and so forth. Ukraine had at Dnipro, back then Dnipropetrovsk, one of the three main manufacturers of intercontinental ballistic missiles. In fact, in 1991, about 70% of strategic ICBM warheads were deployed on Ukrainian-made missiles. That's because of the SS-18s and SS-24s, right, that were made in Dnipro. So the bulk of Soviet deterrent, and the land-based deterrent was really the very important part of the Soviet triad, was deployed on Ukrainian-made missiles, right? But in interactions with Washington, this perhaps was not, Ukrainians felt, was not entirely appreciated, where Russia was viewed as kind of unequivocal, unchallenged successor to the Soviet nuclear legacy, whereas others were unquestioningly just expected to disarm. And that sort of unequal treatment, as it were, was quite a source of ire and many misunderstandings on the Ukrainian part. So hence this demand to recognize, the demand for recognition that we're not just a breadbasket of Europe, we're not just a bunch of peasants toiling the land. We make missiles, and you know what? We have scientists. We have, scientists in Kharkiv and Kyiv. Should we decide to? There is the capacity in this country to create an independent nuclear weapons program. Now, with all the reservations that would be highly costly politically and economically.
And one of the things that runs throughout the book, and I think that you do very well, is at different stages evaluating what at any given time Ukraine's capacity to have turned that nuclear inheritance into something, an arsenal that it could have controlled or not, which was limited at the moment, but in the future could have been something different. And then you make another point that I had slipped on. It was a lot of the debate and a lot of the U.S. effort is focusing on the intercontinental ballistic missiles, which wouldn't have done Ukraine any good in deterring Russia, let's say. But the intermediate nuclear missiles that were eliminated as a result of the treaty in 1987, those would have actually done something in a security sense that was quite different. But I think what you're describing, and you describe it throughout the book, is Ukraine looking for leverage. And it's leverage, because you haven't mentioned how economically in dire shape the country was. But what you do talk about is wanting that sense of equality and respect and so on. So they're looking for leverage. And so take us through a little, what Ukrainian sources, kind of how they thought about and debated whether there was leverage and what the leverage was and what Ukraine was trying to get with that leverage.
So the parameters of the deal or Ukrainian demands, they take shape rather quickly. So already in 1992, Ukrainians say we want security guarantees for sort of surrendering this option, let's say, not the arsenal, not a deterrent, but this option, right? And we want robust security guarantees, and we want financial compensation for the fissile material that's contained in these warheads. And that, again, that claim is predicated on the recognition that these are our warheads to give up, that we're the owners. And here the language is these nuances are very important. Ukrainians don't claim to be, possessors, to be a nuclear weapon state. They say we're owners. So as in property, very deconstructive way of handling nuclear weapons, we're owners to all of the components of these weapons, and we want to be fairly compensated. Now, the United States really doesn't have a problem with that, and whatever the claims might be, there are programs that are being put in place already, megatons to megawatts, right? The swap of highly enriched uranium for low enriched uranium released from the dismantled warheads in Russia. That Ukraine might become then part of that deal. But it does pose a problem with Russia, which is very unwilling to recognize any claims Ukraine might have to these warheads. So, to think about it, to grant Ukraine financial compensation would be, in fact, to recognize Ukraine's claim to ownership. So that becomes a very contentious issue. The other track, security guarantees, Ukraine soon learns that, you can't just demand security guarantees from the United States. There's more than nuclear weapons that might be involved in getting that kind of relationship with the United States, especially if you're just emerging from the Soviet Union. I mean, at that time, in the early 90s, even, a security guarantee via NATO membership to places like Poland and Hungary is still a not decided issue, still a very controversial issue. So Ukraine has these asks and these demands, which are understandable. They're not crazy. It's not a crazy thing to want a deal, for disarmament. And yet, it finds that in these asks, it does have very limited leverage, that the economy is in free fall. 1993, I think, and I remember I was a student in Kyiv at that time, 10,000% inflation. I think only Argentina in the 70s or whenever could beat that. 10,000%. The economy was operating in the dark and, this non-cash way. And if you had any hard currency, you would never exchange more than $5 at the time, because tomorrow it would lose value, right, at this rate. So grappling with that, grappling with Russian supply of or Russian leverage over energy supplies. And Yeltsin says either Ukraine joins an NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state or no oil and gas, period. Not to mention that Ukraine is a heavily nuclearized country in the terms of civilian nuclear energy. 50% of its electricity mix comes from nuclear, and the fuel for nuclear comes from Russia as well. So Russia really, in terms of energy supplies, has an enormous influence, enormous leverage over Ukraine. The United States, of course, is the country that Ukraine wants to get on the good side of and wants to get essentially these security guarantees from, right? But the only tools in Ukraine's hands are kind of delaying disarmament, basically. This is it. And that seems to only make things worse in these conversations and in Washington. So in the end, I think, by about mid-1993, there seems to be a consensus internally that emerges in Ukraine that we are just going to try and make the best deal possible with kind of the limited leverage that we have and move on and try to get beyond maybe guarantees that we can't get, economic cooperation, attention of the World Bank, the IMF, their support for Ukrainian economy, and so forth. So then it still takes some time to put these pieces together, to put this deal together. But by about end of 1993, there's kind of a political decision is made.
There's a I won't read the whole passage, but another great place where you're kind of summarizing the Rada, the Parliament's debate about this and how it goes on over time. But you have a quote at the end of that section from Ukraine's Deputy Foreign Minister, Boris Tarusyuk, who says, quote, "If American policy had been different, Ukraine would have ratified START long ago." And some of the implementers of U.S. policy are with us, thankfully. And so I'm looking forward to the Q&A in the discussion to see how we all look back 30 years ago and reflect on this. But I'm curious to say a little bit more about what was it about the American policy and the approach to Ukraine that intensified the resistance, in a sense, especially in the Rada.
So part of it I address in the sense of kind of the adverse kind of after effects of sort of conflating Russia and the Soviet Union, and how that kind of continued for a while, and in Ukraine's view translated into this Russia first policy in the early 1990s. I mean, some people, and the ones I talked to here in Washington, they say that's not exactly, that's not what we tried to do. We tried to be more equitable with all of the kind of former republics and so forth. And from the Ukrainian standpoint, it was, I guess, an issue that they sensed, right? So, Russia was unquestioningly accepted as a successor state, and the other ones were sort of in this limbo, but really whatever their claims might have been, it was irrelevant as long as they would in the end disarm. The other point was the overarching, overwhelming focus on the nuclear issue alone. So all of these delegations, high-level delegations from state, from interagency, would roll into places that they probably wouldn't have come otherwise, right? Into Minsk, into Almaty, into Kyiv. And the first thing they would ask was, what are you going to do with nuclear weapons? And with the countries that had an enormous set of problems on their hands.
10,000% inflation. We're freaking out with 6%.
Yeah.
We elections pivot on 6%.
Indeed. I mean, you have this giant inefficient economy. You have really, a terrible macroeconomic situation. And, no expertise really locally to deal with any of this. And, the first thing you get asked is, yes, we'll deal with that later, but what are you going to do with nuclear weapons? So sort of that a bit of out of tune kind of messaging from the United States, and with a rather ironic, if inadvertent effect, that it kind of inflated the value of nuclear weapons then in the eyes of these new leaders. They thought, well, if Americans come here and the first thing they ask is nuclear weapons, then those things must be really important. Then we must need to find a way to get something for them. And I have in a book a quote from Vitaly Katayev, who was a Soviet, a Soviet bureaucrat, I guess, from the apex of the military-industrial complex, and his advice was, leave Ukrainians alone. Leave them with their missiles and these warheads. They will come begging you at the end to take these things off your hands because, it takes money and it takes expertise and it takes a lot of things to maintain them and to keep them in good working order. And of course, a lot of these things were in Russia. So this kind of disproportionate attention to the nuclear issue was really a source of kind of tensions and disconnect between, at least for a while, between Kyiv and Washington. Now, you have to be fair, when the Clinton administration comes in, and it's in the spring of 1993, there's a policy review, foreign policy review for the new administration, and there is kind of an understanding that nuclear issue has been overemphasized at the cost of others, that perhaps we need to broaden engagement with Ukraine and other republics, former republics. Beyond that, in an economic and political sphere, and there are at least overtures or attempts to do that with the high-level visits and with kind of engagements beyond the nuclear issue. And that actually perhaps was not decisive, but was certainly very helpful in U.S.-Ukrainian interactions.
Process. Let me, and I know, and I think it's great, and I'm hoping that colleagues who were involved in this will join in the discussion. But let me fast forward or skip ahead or whatever the right expression is to February of 2022 and the most violent Russian aggression. And as you know, and as all of you here know, at various points, we've heard people say, if Ukraine hadn't given up their nuclear weapons, this wouldn't have happened, and variations on that theme. Given your unrivaled expertise on all of this, both historically and in a contemporary sense, what do you think are the one or two biggest misconceptions of that history that kind of have gotten played out in the last couple of years?
So one, of course, is this ahistorical notion that you can just tweak one thing in the past, and that one thing that will be tweaked and will, persist to be different to the present, but the rest will stay the same. Ukraine would certainly be a very different country, right, had it made a different decision on the nuclear issue back in the early 1990s. There's also, at least in kind of general discourse, and I hear that in Ukraine a lot, there's a misconception about, the actual value of that inheritance, the Ukrainian capacity to control the weapons, or things it would have had to have done to control the weapons. And, it's understandable, not everyone is an expert in strategic nuclear weapons, but I think there is this kind of ossified narrative of Ukraine inherited the world's third largest nuclear arsenal and gave it away for nothing. And that is, certainly not true. Ukraine inherited an option, what I'd like to call a proliferator startup package, quite a generous one. And it didn't give it away for nothing. It gave even, whatever you might think of the Budapest Memorandum on security assurances, it is still a political document signed by the heads of states of the three NPT depository states, United States, UK, the Russian Federation, and of course Ukraine. And the fact that it was violated by Russia is, of course, beyond dispute. But, I think there was a way that Ukrainians could have leveraged that document better, as I argue in the book, before 2014. And, of course, the United States and the UK could have chosen to make more of the document post-2014. So that there might have been a missed opportunity there. What I also tried to argue in kind of trying to analyze that decision in retrospect from the current standpoint, that there were other options in between. It's a false dichotomy of just keep these particular weapons or surrender these particular weapons. That there were, there were option, for instance, probably not a very good one, but to transfer warheads to Russia, where they probably would have been best off anyways, and Ukraine could not have rebuilt them, but stay out of NPT and keep a hedge. Whether that would have encountered the same kind of international blowback, possibly, but Pakistan and India and perhaps others tell us that if you survive that blowback, if you wait it out. Now, again, that's assuming that Ukraine could have survived and could have waited out that blowback. Another option, or I think perhaps something that would need further research and further attention in this story, is the fate of the strategic aircraft. And that was under start, but also some that was not under start. And the cruise missiles, not necessarily nuclear tipped, but still strategic, that were all cut up under CTR. So while ICBMs were useless and could have gone, the Tu-95, Tu-160, and a lot of Tu-22 that were not covered by START were also disposed of, because there was kind of a disarmament race at that point. There was money to do that, and people done that, and about 1,000 air-launched cruise missiles. Again, whether that would have been useful for Ukraine today, possibly. I mean, Ukraine is going around begging for long-range fires, and Russia is using that same aircraft to bomb Ukraine from. Now, I'm not, I'm not a specialist in these kind of military operations, and I don't know if you do need that kind of strategic depth like Russia has to fly these aircraft over the Caspian to be able to do that, and something Ukraine might not have had. But I think there was insufficient attention at that point and following the disarmament to Ukraine's conventional capabilities. And I think that was probably the bigger missed opportunity than this overwhelming focus on the nuclear decision.
Was there, and we're going to wrap up and open the conversation soon, but was there in Ukraine, and I'd asked people who were in the U.S. government at the time in the U.S., was there an assessment that had Ukraine tried to take possession of those weapons, whether Russia would have intervened militarily or otherwise? In other words, physically, was it really an option, or would there have been an intervention? And I remember, I was younger then, but I remember at the time the sense that had Russia intervened, it wasn't clear that the U.S. would have really had a big objection if it was merely to take the weapons out. In other words, that the U.S. policy was, as you said, so focused on the weapons. But was there thinking in Ukraine about that? Or?
So there was certainly consideration of it. And the U.S. also paid attention. There are CIA estimates and analyses about how likely would that option would have been. In my communications, in my interviews with the Ukrainian military folks that were in charge at the time, that did not seem to have been a big worry, partially because Russia would have had many other ways to sabotage. If Ukraine had either kept them or, again, keeping these particular weapons, there wasn't really a particularly attractive options. But if Ukraine kept part of the delivery vehicles and kept maybe an option for an indigenous nuclear program open, Russia had other ways to sabotage it that were major conventional offensive. Ukraine was very transparent to Russia at that time. Although I have to say, Russia was also a pretty messy place at the time, and it was also very much transparent to Ukrainians as well. After already the book was published, I met a gentleman, a Ukrainian, who was the head of the archive department at the Ministry of Media Machine Building. Oh, wow. And those who know, they know that it's a ministry, cryptic name for Ministry of All Things Nuclear. This guy sat at the archives. And in early 1992, he relocated to Kyiv with his family and said that for the next 2 years, he would shuttle back and forth between Kyiv and Moscow and could still go into the Ministry of Media and Machine Building with his pass to have, to chat with his former colleagues. So I guess, again, the fact that Ukraine was not just something that appeared out of nowhere, but was a really part and parcel of this Soviet nuclear enterprise gets underappreciated and wasn't appreciated at that time, and now probably there's not much appreciation of it today. But had there been a concerted political will, which there wasn't, right, there were some options that were available to Ukraine, and that's kind of part of the message that I tried to convey in this book. Ukraine did have agency, and it did have options. The fact that it chose the right one, right, in the end, the least costly one, it doesn't reject the fact that it could have decided otherwise. States make all sorts of bad decisions, right?
Yeah, it was such a different, it just felt so different then, obviously, than it does now. I mean, everywhere. I mean, whether it was Russia, here, Europe, it was so different. So it's hard in this current moment to kind of go back and think about that. Look, if anybody has comments, questions, let's start, and then I'll call on you, and then introduce yourself, please. We'll start with Ambassador Graham, but still introduce yourself. And then Mackenzie's got to remind me to read ones from online too. But please.
I'm Tom Graham. I was very much involved in these events. I was part of the Bartholomew group that went to the 4 states and so forth, and heard Ukraine declare itself the France of the East, and therefore it should have nuclear weapons, signaling some kind of problems, I thought. But my question is a little different. Mariana, do you think that realistically Ukraine could have kept the weapons and actually integrated them into its own military system, or was it just a paper option? If it was a real option and they had exercised it, could you say a little more about what you think might have happened and how Ukraine might have been different?
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you for coming, Ambassador Graham. It's lovely to see you. I have interviewed Ambassador.
He's in the book. You're in the book.
You're in the book very prominently. So I'd like to disaggregate the word weapons. Could have Ukraine kept those nuclear warheads on its territory? No. Sooner or later, Ukraine did not manufacture them, it couldn't maintain them. Sooner or later, it would have had to transfer them to Russia. Could Ukraine have kept a portion of delivery vehicles? Yes. The strategic bombers and even the air-launched cruise missiles, of which it had 1,000. Some of them were nuclear-tipped, but others were not. They were still considered strategic weapons, right? And ICBMs probably were useless, even though there was sort of a thought or an option that was pushed by the missile makers in Dnipro to keep the infrastructure for the ICBMs and sort of somehow modify that to Ukraine's strategic needs. So perhaps a shorter range missile with a conventional, sort of a precursor to prompt global strike, I don't know. But in that instance, as you, George, mentioned, Ukrainians came up against the INF Treaty because it seems that the ranges that would have been very useful to deter Russia were prohibited by the INF Treaty from 500 to 5,500 kilometers. So Ukraine would have been in breach of that. But I think there's still a question about bombers and cruise missiles that could have possibly been decided differently. Now, whether an insistence on bombers and cruise missiles, conventionally armed, right, so not nuclear armed, would have sort of provoked a really adverse reaction in the West, possibly, because there was kind of this push towards just kind of eliminating strategic weapons, eliminating, kind of taking the military and nuclear and strategic sort of element out of relations or diminishing it, minimizing in relations between states and as tools of statecraft. So that would have been going against what I call the zeitgeist, right, against the grain. But again, if Ukraine could have weathered that initial part, given that the nuclear bit would have been transferred out. Then perhaps it wouldn't have been, terrible.
The gentleman there, and then Seema, yeah.
In case, I had a question just about the origins of the story. I note that you located in Azerbaijan. And I wonder, we've known for some time that the Hungarian government asked Gorbachev in 1989 to please remove these sort of clandestine nuclear weapons. And do you see any consonances and unities between that kind of decision by the Soviet Union in 1989 to remove nuclear weapons from its periphery and the desire of kind of more well-known nuclear powers like France and the UK to develop nuclear abilities as their empires were collapsing? Are there any kind of strategic consonances there?
So if I understand correctly, you're making references to tactical nuclear weapons or low battlefield nuclear weapons that were stored and deployed in the former Warsaw Pact countries, including Hungary and East Germany and elsewhere. And there was a large cache of these also in Ukraine, but also those were deployed across the entire Soviet Union. And you're quite correct that the Soviet military, or the 12th GUMO, the Directorate of the Ministry of Defense, began kind of quietly removing them from these countries already in '89. Part of it was kind of the eruption of ethnic conflict in some of the areas of the Soviet Union, in the Caucasus and Central Asia. Part of it was that, for instance, the Baltics, already beginning in 1988, were really marching towards independence very, very quickly. So there was kind of an idea that we better remove those weapons. And lower yield, tactical, right, is the wrong way to describe them, but just for simplicity's sake, those were, some of them were gravity bombs, artillery shells, short-range missile charges, right? Those were more grabbable, right? Those were easier to grab and possibly easier to use in an unauthorized manner. Yes, some of them were protected by permissive action links, but I'm told that, with enough expertise and maybe some tinkering, you can break those locks if you know what you're doing or figure it out. So those were really the higher risk weapons, and those also could be removed quite quickly. So by 1991, by September 1991. The Soviet military removed all of the weapons, these tactical nuclear weapons, from all of the republics, with the exception of Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. And following that, there were the presidential nuclear initiatives that, understanding that risk and kind of provided for kind of subsequent reason and cover couched in bilateral arms control sort of terms, to continue the withdrawal of tactical nuclear weapons to Russia, to central storage facilities, as those were called. But that could not have been done so easily with strategic weapons, right? They were sitting on top of the missiles, so that it took some time and took the special way to remove them and store them and so forth. I don't quite understand what you mean by, the French and British nuclear armament. I don't know, if that is how closely those decisions were connected with the shrinkage of their empire, with the sort of their decolonization. I think there was more sort of post-World War II the processes and the development of these programs by the victorious powers in World War II. So I don't know if there is a direct connection there.
Mackenzie, can we come here? Hang on one second. Introduce yourself, please.
Yes, I'm Dr. Gonzalez on CIFAI, so it's a private corporate company.
I couldn't hear you. Sorry. Speak up a little bit.
Yes, I am Dr. Gonzalez, and I am from the private sector, from the company CI for AI, more in the artificial intelligence. My question is, I see some sort of, maybe not contradiction, but the following problem. At that time, there was a lot of pressure from the West, the European countries and the US, and tried to, if not force, but kind of decide in Ukraine to get rid of all the nuclear. But isn't it some sort of contradiction because they say, well, Russia fell apart, the Soviet Union, and now we have Russia. But they are giving them the power now, the entire power of having all the nuclear weapons. What was the thinking at that time? I mean, they didn't think that in a way, they're making it even powerful, even if the Soviet Union disintegrate. I am just wondering what was thinking at that time.
You know, it's an excellent observation because really the world shifted so rapidly at the end of 80s, early 90s, that there were really some of these paradoxical things happening. And, you know, I have a quote in the book from one of the American sort of observers or officials who is saying, you know, there's something really quite ironic about the fact that here we are trying to, you know, remove these weapons from the non-Russian republics and give them to Russia so that they could be turned around and pointed at us. Mm-hmm. And in the Bush administration, actually, there was a very minority. It wasn't a particularly pronounced position, and one that garnered any following at the end of the day. But you know, Vice President Dick Cheney and even National Security Advisor Brown Scowcroft they were sort of saying, maybe we shouldn't be rushing. We shouldn't be putting all this pressure. I mean, you know, we can always get them to denuclearize at the end, but let's wait out and see what this was going to be like. But I think some of the fears or considerations were of potential instability, right? And so you had a large empire that was falling apart. And there was already a precedent of an empire falling apart. It was in the Balkans. It was Yugoslavia. And it was erupting into wars. So this whole Yugoslavia with nukes imagery was really quite powerful at the time, right? So whatever the situation, the understanding was that the fewer fingers on the nuclear button, the better for everyone involved. But yeah, that does not alleviate the fact that that was quite a paradoxical situation.
Two people who might be able to explain the U.S. position, but they don't have to. I've got Bob Einhorn and Mark Fitzpatrick, and then I've got, you have a question, right? You raise your hand. Oh, okay, great. And then is there anybody over here, I've been neglecting, and I don't have eyes in the back of my head, though I try to tell children I do. No? Okay, great. So Bob and Mark, and then.
Thanks, George. Thank you very much, Mariana. I thought of two questions, and I can't decide between them, so I'll ask them both.
He's a diplomat.
One, you referred in your remarks to the possibility that the West might have been able to use its tools a bit better. I think you're referring to the Budapest Memorandum, and I'd like you to expand on that. I mean, the Budapest Memorandum was a pretty weak instrument. The Ukraine had asked the Bush administration and the Clinton administration for much stronger security guarantees, kind of analogous to the NATO Article 5, guarantee. But both administrations rejected that, and Ukraine had no choice but to settle for something which was basically a restatement of general international the UN Charter and so forth. The one new element was a commitment to consult in the event of an abridgment of Ukrainian territorial integrity or sovereignty. They had to consult. And after the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the aggression in eastern Ukraine, I think John Kerry, who was Secretary of State, tried to convene a group of members, and the Russians didn't show up. My first question is, how could that have been used better? How did the West fail diplomatically in 2014? Second question is, second guessing in Kyiv. Regrets about giving up this inheritance. I remember in 2014, there were some Ukrainian politicians who said, why did we give up these nuclear weapons? Maybe we should get back into the nuclear weapons business as a result. How serious and practical was it at the time? Did any Ukrainians who knew something about the technology and so forth, did they seriously study what it would take to reestablish some kind of a nuclear weapons program? And now after the current aggression, has there been further questioning of, should we have given up? And is there any serious interest today in Ukraine in pursuing a nuclear weapons option? I would also like to ask you, what are the prospects of Ukrainian membership in NATO, and if you have views on that? But I will defer that third question.
We're okay on time, so go ahead and answer this one, then we'll go to Mark.
So the third question shouldn't be to me, it should be to the NATO member states that will be convening here in Washington later on, right, this year for a big one. So one about the Budapest Memorandum. You're absolutely right, Bob, that it was a restatement of clauses from the UN Charter, from the OSCE Helsinki Final Act, the NPT-related negative and positive nuclear security assurances, and this clause on the mechanism of consultations. But I have argued that beyond kind of the actual letter of the Budapest Memorandum, it was a significant political document that accompanied Ukraine's accession to the NPT. And in that, it became part and parcel of the greater non-proliferation regime. Right? No other country other than Ukraine and, well, Tokjan is gone, but Kazakhstan and Belarus got a copy-paste sort of version of this document that Ukraine negotiated, and they sort of, because they came as a package, they got the same assurances. But no other country joined the NPT with that sort of set of even political security assurances. So in that, there was a recognition. Just in the very existence of this document, there was a recognition of Ukraine's legitimate security concerns that predicated the signature of this document. Fast forward to 2014, what could, Ukraine could have, let me just first say that before 2014, Ukraine probably could have leveraged that document a little bit better. Ukrainians were like, they translated it as guarantees, not assurances, into Ukrainian, but also Russian. It's guarantees in Russian, and shelved it and said, look, we have guarantees. That document could have served as a framework for deeper bilateral or trilateral, if you include the UK, defense and military cooperation, perhaps leveraging that as a kind of foundation for some sort of a relationship of that sort. After 2014, when Ukrainians were like, wait a minute, here's, pulled out this document, the Americans and the British could have made more. There's a choice to do that. These documents, normally, whether they're legally binding or non-legally binding, international documents are often made intentionally ambiguous to leave room for this sort of thing. And to live up to the spirit of the recognition of Ukraine's security concerns at the time, the United States and the UK could have certainly made more of the Budapest Memorandum, if nothing more than at least couch the military and defense aid that was going to Ukraine at the time. There was close to $2 billion of aid provided between 2014 and 2022 to Ukraine as part of fulfilling these commitments. That would have done no harm. That aid was already going, and I think it would have further bolstered the non-proliferation regime to say, look, the country did the right thing. It gave up nuclear options, whatever, weapons, whatever you want to call it, and we're standing by it. And I think the sidelining of the document altogether has created really unfortunate optics. And also, coming to a second question, gave rise to voices in Ukraine saying, let's withdraw from the NPT. You know, we've been sort of betrayed not only by Russia that blatantly violated it, but here the other signatories don't seem to be doing much. Those voices seem to have been coming mostly sort of from political rather than military milieu in Ukraine. And my interpretation was that they were really there to draw attention to the document, to draw attention to the commitment, rather than seriously sort of threaten, the launch of an indigenous nuclear program, because then Ukraine would have had to contend with the same set of problems that it did back in the 1990s. It relied on Western support and aid more than it could have afforded to defy it. And, as a testament to that, post February 2022, those voices disappeared altogether because of this great reliance of Ukraine on Western military aid. And of course, once you're in the war, it's the conventional weaponry that really makes or breaks the day for Ukrainians. And, what I think the danger is here, and perhaps we disagree because you've argued otherwise, I know, especially after 2014, is that by undermining the credibility of the non-proliferation regime more generally, it might be conducive to proliferation elsewhere. Now, I don't envision a domino effect right away, but the future is long. There's still a lot of years in the future, and we don't know how other states might interpret this kind of precedent.
Yeah, very quickly, and then we'll go to Mark. Yeah.
It can be answered yes or no, so it won't take long. The Budapest Memorandum, politically binding, secure the borders, but a politically binding agreement, except the United States said it would treat it as though it were a treaty. Did Ukraine put any, did they think that meant anything?
I think the understanding in Ukraine was, I can't really answer yes or no to that because I haven't seen a specific discussion. I think that it was more emphasized on this side of the ocean that it was, political memorandum of understanding, not a legally binding treaty. In Ukraine, it was a word given by a U.S. president that stood for something. So,
Mark.
Thanks very much. Mark Fitzpatrick, International Institute for Strategic Studies. I have a very simple question, which when I pose it, you're going to say, haven't you been listening to anything I've been saying? But it's the question I always get when I talk about Ukraine war to general audiences, not this sophisticated audience, but it's the question you get all the time, sure. Would Russia have invaded if Ukraine had kept the nuclear weapons? And when I used to answer, I would give a more sophisticated answer. I would say, well, you can't just change one thing, But no, they want a yes or no answer. So my answer, I just decided would be no. They wouldn't have invaded in 2022. They would have invaded back in 1994 because Russians wouldn't have allowed Ukraine to have a nuclear weapon that was usable, that could be used against Russia. And even though Ukraine couldn't use it at the time, they were smart enough. They could have developed the command and control mechanisms to do it. What part of that answer would you suggest I improve upon?
So diplomatic, Mark.
So for 1994 part of it, again, to go back to our previous conversation, I think it's a kind of false option to set up that Ukraine would have kept those particular weapons, right? And if it didn't keep those particular weapons in 1994, but somehow reconfigured its option differently by, for instance, staying outside of the NPT, keeping up nuclear research, perhaps when they, go and got better economically, saying, look, we got all these nuclear power plants. We need a full fuel cycle. I mean, Iran's doing that with a lot less of a nuclear power in the, in their story and say, we don't want to depend on on Russian supply of nuclear fuel. We need our own independent nuclear fuel. So that kind of hedging strategy might have been something that would have worked for Ukraine without encountering, too much adverse international pushback, especially as Russia would have gotten, less of a nice player and would have been suddenly seen more of a threat, not just by Ukraine, but also by the West. All these counterfactuals, if everything kind of went according to the best case scenario, and Ukraine did have some kind of nuclear weapon or option today or in 2022, I don't imagine sort of nuclear deterrence would have worked differently for Ukraine than it does for other countries. If we believe that nuclear deterrence does do some kind of work, then it would have probably at least induced a different set of calculations to someone like Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, that's a great question, great answer. Can we get the microphone? Yeah, Mackenzie's bringing it. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Mariana. My name is Polina Sinovets. I'm the head of Odessa Center for Non-Proliferation, now based in Elliott School for International Affairs. And we have also published a book, Ukraine's Nuclear History. I've edited it, so I can add a little bit to the picture because, of course, Mariana's book is fantastic. It's written greatly, but of course, the many views are. So speaking about tactical nuclear weapons and the fact that why this story moved so quickly, Mariana, and there was a question about the permissive action links. As far as I understand, the permissive action links started to be installed on tactical nuclear weapons in the Soviet Union in late 80s, and they finished it in 1993. So there is a strong suggestion that there were no permissive action links at the Ukrainian-based tactical nuclear weapons at that time. And this is why that story was developing so quickly and so furiously, because on one hand, we knew that a short moment of time when President Kravchuk it looked like he really tried to explore the issue of acquiring nuclear deterrence, while first it was the oath of allegiance, by the base of the strategic bombers in Uzin. Then it was the administrative decree on the administrative control of nuclear weapons, and actually the stop of the removal of the tactical nuclear weapons to Russia. And at some point, there was a hope, and at some point, President Kravchuk also suggested the United States to build up the facility to dismantle nuclear weapons at the territory of Ukraine. So I had a personal interview with President Kravchuk. Of course, he didn't say that he wanted nuclear weapons, but he said one thing. He said, I tried, because he was very much overburdened with that feeling of guilt, which everyone in Ukraine was putting on his shoulders. So he said, I really tried to go on with nuclear deterrence, but I could not do it, but I failed. First of all, because he really didn't have enough of control over these tactical nuclear weapons. And according to his words, most of the control belonged to the CIS joint forces. So actually, when he was in the United States, he was brought greetings with the fact that all tactical nuclear weapons were removed from Ukraine. And then nobody in Ukraine really understood who was guilty in that, because Parliament didn't give the permission, President didn't give the permission, MFA didn't know about it. Only Ministry of Defense said, actually, we took the responsibility coming from the fact that there was a reconciliation in regard of tactical nuclear weapons between Russia and Ukraine. We took the responsibility to remove these weapons. So actually, Kravchuk didn't control that weapons. And it was the biggest concerns of Russians, because during that short springtime, when Kravchuk was resisting to remove these weapons from Ukraine, there were sort of the mailings between the CIA and there are some archival information that there were Russian generals who said that if those weapons would not be removed from Ukraine, we'll just physically destroy them at the territory of Ukraine. So the United States just tried even to constrain Russians a bit. And then coming back to Mark's question, because it's very much related, I think that you are very right that probably Ukraine, if Ukraine tried to retain some warheads, they really could be destroyed by Russians, and Ukraine could be attacked by Russia just to destroy them. And then probably it would not be Ukraine, that country which managed to retain nuclear weapons at that time, because Ukrainian state was very weak, didn't have any strategic vision, didn't have any understanding of what it is and how to behave and what the real threats were. However, again, if it was the other state and Ukraine really had nuclear weapons, then Putin would never attack. Because looking forward at the whole track of the record of the Putin's behavior during all these years, we see that he never attacked anybody strong. He never attacked anybody who could present any real serious threat to his own security. And actually, nuclear weapons, no matter how many of them Ukraine could retain, they would really pose physical threat to his own existence. So he never went on that level enough. Yes, I think it's enough for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Mariana, the last word. We've got to wrap up, but and then I'm going to thank you. But if you have any final comments to offer.
Just perhaps the words with which I end the book and drawing attention to the fact that this war is a conventional war, but it's very much a nuclear conflict in the sense that nuclear threats and nuclear issues are a part of the story, including Ukraine's nuclear history, right? The optics of the situation are not good. And most people in the world are not nuclear experts who know, how nuclear weapons work and what stays and what goes and how we're really, in formulating policy towards Ukraine today, we still have influence in how the story might be interpreted, right? The story of Ukraine's nuclear disarmament, as it were, is not over yet.
Right. Yeah.
And we have a way of shaping the lessons which other states might take from this story. And we certainly don't want the lesson to be that nuclear weapons are a really strong currency of international statecraft.
Yeah. That's a great way to end. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. And if you haven't, like you say, it really is a wonderful read and an excellent book. But thank you all. Mariana,
Thank you so much.
Thank you.